Hello everyone, really great to be here with you again. It's always a real privilege and the highlight of the start of my year, kind of in the midst of the grey, cold January. This is such an uplift to your spirit, and it's great to be here to celebrate with you all. And especially, I come from Middlesbrough, I'm a northeast boy, and as some of you will know, I kind of grew up on a council estate in Hemington that was known as Prisoner Cell Block H, because every street was, began with the letter H. And I planned a talk, and I've already kind of deleted it in my head, so you just have to go on the ride with me. And so I grew up on this council estate, and parents were on benefits for most of my life, and so money was tough, and for a lot of years it was so tight, there'd literally be kind of all we could afford was a 5 kilo bag of potatoes and a tray of 36 eggs. And as I was in school, I was in the bottom set for every subject. For English, for example, we weren't allowed to study Shakespeare. The teachers didn't think that we could understand it. So they offered us a book called Boys from the Black Stuff, which is a group of builders, working class builders who, Yozo was going around saying, gives a job. And so growing up feeling like an underdog and less than was my norm, to be honest. And grew up in a household where my dad would get absolutely hammered and then beat my mum to a pulp. So life was difficult in early childhood, lots of adverse childhood experiences. And I guess I'm sharing some things quite personal and vulnerable to share from the stage, because on Tuesday I was kind of blown away by something that happened, which I'll share about in a moment. And coming in today, I spoke to Peter, and I was just asking him about one of my family members who's currently in addiction. And in the last 12 months, he was so badly beaten by the crack dealers after he stole their crack that he couldn't walk. It beat him so badly. And I've had friends and family members who are in addiction, some of whom have died and not here today, and some of whom thankfully are and have recovered. And I was reminded of a quote by Marcus Garvey that said, "The vision of self and the future life is all that has helped the oppressed become free." And I found in my own life that to be very true, that in the midst of the madness of growing up in that house and in such abject poverty and in an geographic area which you guys all know the stats, don't you, for violence and prison rates and morbidity rates and all of that stuff, it leaves you feeling your identity is marred and spoiled. People like us. Yeah, I remember applying to university, my knees are knocking, because everyone on my street went to prison, was in drug addiction, or on benefits. So who was I to be applying to go to university? And yet here I am today as an associate professor about to speak at the United Nations again for the 4th year in a row. And I was reminded of the Marcus Garvey quote as I was thinking of my cousin, currently in a vulnerable person's kind of residential space right now this day. And I was thinking, why? Something kicked in for me at age 13 when I was bored shitless during the 6-week school holidays. 6 weeks. At this stage, my mum was doing fiddle work, and she'd work as a cleaner. She would clean the Halifax and some really big banks, but she worked for someone who paid her the grand sum total of £1 per hour. And she'd be gone from 8 in the morning till 8 o'clock at night for £12 per day. And that still brings tears to my eyes today, knowing that my mother had to work for £12 a day. And it was during the 6-week summer holidays. There was a sunny day and I was in my bedroom, and my dad was still in bed. And I was like, what am I going to do today in my head? And I'm looking out the window and I was just really, just bored. And I'm just having this daydream, fantasizing what I could do, but then somehow something crashed in, and I started seeing these pictures of books, and that one day I would write books and that those books would help people. And I turned 50 in the summer last year, in July, and I'm proud to say it took 37 years for that kind of daydream to come to fulfillment, and I believe that 3 of those books are on the screen right there. Because what happened was 3 years ago, I was invited to speak at the United Nations. Go figure. The boy from the ghetto. And I was absolutely bricking it. And I was like, what am I going to say? And I prepared this PowerPoint, and as every good imposter does, you overcompensate, don't you? Because you always think that you're not good enough. So I spent like a ridiculous, like a month preparing this PowerPoint. But then when I read it back, it was just awful. All of the worst stats of the barriers that people in addiction face and in recovery, and isn't it awful, isn't it awful? And it is awful, yeah? But I thought, that's not a story I want to tell about people from my community. Because growing up in the hood, I didn't see all of the deficits and the brokenness, because they were my mum and my dad and my aunties and my uncles and my cousins, and I knew there was such strength and resilience there. So I deleted the PowerPoint, and I'm flying out to the United Nations, and I've now got nothing to say. And I'm like, what am I going to say? But regardless of what I had to say, what I made a promise back in March 2023 was that, what can I do to stop repeating this story of isn't it awful for people in recovery? So I decided to create a publishing house called New Central Media. And the aim, I guess if you like, the mission of New Central Media is to elevate lived experience voices. That actually, as somebody who's never used drugs, isn't that just a miracle? Talking about miracles earlier, that is a miracle. Why I never used drugs, I've got no idea. And was certainly offered them plenty of times during my time in Middlesbrough. And I often wonder, how come I made it out? How come I live this life that I do now that's so very different? And for me, it was that vision of the future self, at age 13, when that daydream crashed in, that I could be different and that my life could be different. It was that pulled me out of bed. And so then as a recovery researcher many years later, and we've heard about it today, Professor David Patton this morning, talking about the contagion of recovery. It doesn't always have to come in the form of a daydream. Oftentimes it comes like somebody else standing up in a room and saying, hi, I'm David, I'm 15 years clean. Yeah, that can give you the hope that you can be somebody different and that life can be different. So that contagion can come in different ways. But I believe that that's absolutely essential. If you want to grow in recovery or just in life generally, you've got to get that vision of a future self, and you've got to get that vision of a future life that you believe is possible, and then you've got to start moving towards it. And we've heard just on the panel how they, in that very beginning year, began to see a different way of living, and they did all the uncomfortable stuff to move towards it. If I think back to myself at age 13, going back to secondary school in the bottom set, deciding that all of a sudden I don't want to leave school like the rest of my family with no qualifications. So I'd be in the bottom set going, Miss, when you said that, what does that mean? Can you just explain that again? I wasn't the popular kid, because if you're in the bottom set asking questions is not nothing to do, you get your head kicked in. My neighbour 3 doors down, he burnt the school down, kind of during the summer holidays before. So it takes work, you've got to put in the effort. Reading the textbooks, my goodness, it was like they were speaking in Russian. I had no clue what these textbooks were saying. So I had a little dictionary, and every word I didn't understand, which was every other word at first. I'd have to write down, look it up in a paper dictionary before the days of the internet, and I'd have this little kind of jotter pad, 99 pence from the pound shop, of all the words that I ever read that I didn't understand. And now I kind of publish in academic journals internationally. And that's the power of when you put the work in. It's been a real proud moment for me to publish these books 37 years later, but also to look around the room and see so many of the authors who've contributed to these books. Because for me, seeing your name and recognising you as a paid and published author, Peter, the New York Times best-selling title is coming for you soon, I believe it, buddy. knowing that you guys are the real experts, because I've not used drugs, as I was saying. So everything I've learned comes from this community and communities like this all around the world. So coming in with the surveys and the interviews that we typically do, and then taking the information and the ideas that you shared and writing it up in this academic language, and then the publications are in my name, and then I get promoted on the back of what you told me. Well, hang on, that can't be right, can it? That can't be right. And so that's why 100% of the profits from the New Central Media books goes direct to the authors, an equal share, however many authors there are in the book, the profits are shared equally. And there's no administrative charges or publication charges. All of my editing, there's no fee. The people who do the proofreading, there's no fee. So it's genuinely 100% of the profits go to everybody. And there was a really kind of proud moment, because on Tuesday we launched the third book. And the third book, so we've done 3 books so far. One was about prisons and does prison help or hinder recovery. The second book was around women and how do women recover different to men. But the third book, which has just come out recently, was about lived experience recovery organisations. I don't need to tell the audience what one of those is. But what you had here is a photograph of the 14 Lero leaders from all across the UK, England, Scotland, Wales, gathering in the British Library with Dame Carol Black, with Professor Ed Day, who's a National Recovery Champion, with representation from the prison service. We all convened and gathered around the same table, and it was such a powerful moment, not just because all of the leaders of Leros were there, but the validation from the other agents and being at the British Library. We legally deposited the book in the British Library. And just before we'd done that, Dame Carol Black, who was the chair of the British Library, she'd asked the staff to get out the archives, different types of books. And so we saw a letter from Oscar Wilde from the 1700s when he was in prison, and Elizabeth Fry, when she was reforming the prisons, and there was a doctor who'd written poetry to his client who were in addiction, trying to help them overcome alcoholism and drug use. And the truth was, somebody said it at the meeting, that in 100 years, actually the Lero's book will be the literature that's kind of wielded out. And my encouragement to everyone in the room today is, 1, what's your dream for yourself? What future self do you see? And if you can't answer that question, I encourage you at the start of the new year, rather than setting a New Year's resolution, let's get crystal clear on the future person that you can become. And here's another clue. If it's within grasp, you're not dreaming big enough. It's got to be so way beyond what's currently possible. That's the person who's calling you to come forward. In the same way with your life. My life is unrecognizable from the life I used to live in that prisoner cell block H, with my dad beating my mother in poverty, and the life that my children now lead is a world away from the life that I inhabited. So I'm going to end with this quote, because I think that it was a landmark moment on Tuesday, that for your knowledge to be celebrated and deposited at the British Library, a space where, let's be honest, publishers, they love experts, they love people with qualifications, but these publications are elevating lived experience knowledge and saying this form of knowledge is valid. And oftentimes, and we've seen it today, people coming up on stage and, I'm nervous, and people who've come up on the stage are nervous. It's that belief, isn't it, that somebody else, somebody who's more qualified, more experienced than I, am meant to be on the stage in front of a microphone or winning an award or being recognised. And the truth is that the knowledge in this room is phenomenal. The experience, the wisdom, and it's not a story. Dot and I were in Dublin recently. I was we're on a visiting professorship kind of event, and I was telling Dot off, she was kind of referring to stories, and I was going, no, Dot, it's evidence, it's narrative truth in research terms. We've got to change the dialogue. We're speaking a lot around stigma today. And one of the ways in which we can challenge it, actually this isn't just a personal story, this is data, yeah? This is evidence. My life is a living evidence of what's possible, that systems need to change, I know what works, and here's a community of evidence around, look at what you've built. That's what we're celebrating today. This is one huge database around what works, and we need to reframe the narrative that you guys are the experts, you guys have got authority, don't cower back, speak your voice, be authentic and stand on your truth, and look at what can be possible. Bringing those people together in that room was phenomenal. So I'll end with a quote by Paulo Freire that said, "This then is the greatest historical task of the oppressed, to liberate themselves but also their oppressors as well." And so I think one of the meanings there is that recovery is often framed as a personal journey, okay? That, here am I, I'm an individual and I wasn't well and all of this bad stuff happened to me, often at a young age. But through X, Y, and Z I got better. And there's one level on which that is true, okay? And let's celebrate all of the truth in that. But there's also a bigger story, I think, that's occurring. That as we heard with the culture of recovery and the way in which you guys practice as a community, the way of living with authenticity, bringing your whole self into spaces, showing up with purpose and passion, being unapologetic, being messy, being willing to make mistakes, being vulnerable, asking for help. All of that is kind of the opposite of the way the world tells us to live, isn't it? And I think that's what Paulo Freire is talking about here, that the way you guys live and the values that you hold and the norms and the practices that you cultivate, they are healing for the rest of society. That's why, as I shared in the panel, people 5 years plus in recovery have got high levels of quality of life and well-being. It's because you guys live differently. Equally, when you're working with different services, different organisations, oftentimes who you're feeling the stigma from, who you're hearing the judgment from, keep modelling your way of working, because your way of working will be liberatory to others. So my encouragement to you all today to end is to keep doing what you're doing, and I look forward to continuing the journey with you all. So thank you so much.